You know that Justin Trudeau has become a lightning rod for a lot of the dissatisfaction in this country. And is he a liability going into this election, or is he an asset?
I would say.
In a recent CBC interview, MP Champagne, also affectionately known as Frankie Bubbles, was asked whether Justin Trudeau is an asset or a liability. For many Canadians, this question just had to be put out there to no other than a strong supporter of Trudeau like Champagne. Brian observed that the changing sentiment around Trudeau is striking, having become a focal point for much of the country's dissatisfaction. So what did Champagne have to think?
It's what you've seen in other countries, that when people are facing a lot of issues, there's frustration. And frustration is reflected oftentimes, you've seen in the recent election, on their leaders. And therefore, there is that. But when you step back, that's why I say to people, in which society, leaving the personalities apart, in which society do you want to live in? What is dear to you? Okay. To whom would you give the key of the house?
Champagne simply and obviously pointed out that in times of frustration, leaders often bear the brunt of public discontent. This phenomenon overall isn't unique to Canada. It's something seen globally when people face significant challenges. He emphasized that beyond personalities, voters should consider which societal values matter the most to them and who they trust with the country's future.
Final choice. That's how democracy works.
You are not saying that the Prime Minister, that Justin Trudeau, is an asset going into the next election.
He's the leader. He's been providing leadership, and that's what Canadians want to see. It's not an issue about, I'm not going into these, whether people would see it. They see in him the leader of the Liberal Party, and certainly has been an asset in providing steady leadership.
When pressed further, Champagne argued for doing what's best for Canadians, leaving the ultimate decision to the voters. He also pointed out Trudeau's decade-long leadership and experience, suggesting that in turbulent times, Canadians might prefer a seasoned leader. According to Champagne, despite the controversies, Trudeau has provided steady leadership.
Your leader and the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, talks about Canada having a feminist foreign policy. I'm wondering if you can explain to Canadians what that means, and how does that align with selling billions of dollars of arms and weapons to a nation like Saudi Arabia? And how is it that under your government, we have been the second largest arms supplier to the Middle East? So what is a feminist foreign policy, and how does that fit into it?
In a separate interview, a Liberal MP and a supporter of Trudeau found himself caught off guard when asked about the meaning behind Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's claim that Canada has a feminist foreign policy. The panelist pointed out the apparent contradiction between this policy and Canada's significant arms sales to countries like Saudi Arabia. So, which was it? A jaw-jaw policy or a war policy, as suggested?
And the government has shown
Can you please explain what a feminist foreign policy is? I'm not sure what that means.
20,000 Afghanistan...
I don't want numbers, I want an explanation. What is a feminist foreign policy? What does that mean?
But certainly when it comes to the foreign affairs policy, we got to be fair.
The MP struggled to provide a clear definition of what a feminist foreign policy even entails. He initially tried to shift the conversation to the Liberal government's balanced approach to foreign policy, referencing past humanitarian efforts, such as aiding Syrian refugees in 2015 and responding to the crisis in Afghanistan. However, these examples didn't really address the core question about the feminist foreign policy and its implications.
I'm wondering about your reaction to the fairly open criticism Canada came under this week, and whether you would feel pressure to meet that 2% target.
First of all, it's clear now Justin Trudeau is seen as an absolute joke on the world stage. I was embarrassed to see our Prime Minister treated like a human piñata by the rest of the NATO countries.
Speaking of foreign policy, Justin Trudeau has often faced criticism from Canada's defense spending when he attends NATO meetings. NATO leaders have had to constantly remind him that Canada owes the alliance money. But Trudeau has been known to counter by highlighting the country's commitment to fighting climate change. So far, he's lucky that the response has been met with indifference from NATO. Otherwise, who knows what could happen in a worst-case scenario.
kept his environment minister in place, Montreal MP Stephen Guilbeault, and the PM's advisors could point to their internal polls again for that decision. First, Quebec voters consistently rated climate change and the environment as the most important issue of the day, even as Canadians in Ontario, the West, and Atlantic Canada were saying that the cost of housing and inflation was the #1 issue.
And where are the elected officials who are willing to challenge Trudeau's policies? Many appear to be trapped in a bubble of agreement and progressive ideology, afraid to voice dissent like the proverbial yes men. This reluctance to speak out and balance the conversation has led to a significant loss of support for the Liberals, with even some longtime supporters distancing themselves from the party.
To create it for another day. But I have troubles when you talk about modern treaty and you include Métis with the modern treaty, but you're disrespecting the historic treaties. There wouldn't be a Canada if it wasn't for our treaties. You know, you talk about nation to nation. There's a troublesome resolution. I don't even know if you look at all the resolutions. Resolution 35 dealing with treaty. We want to talk about nation to nation.
At a recent Indigenous Peoples Forum, a Trudeau representative faced tough questions from attendees. One passionate speaker highlighted the disrespect shown to historic treaties, emphasizing that Canada's existence hinges on these agreements. They further criticized the Trudeau government for talking about nation-to-nation relationships without meaningful action, pointing out that real respect requires treating Indigenous people as equals, even in everyday interactions.
You come talk to me. You don't come talk to this AFN table or whatnot. You want respect, you got to treat us the same. At least say hi on the street when I pass you. You know, and the Natural Resource Transfer Act. No, we shouldn't be struggling in our own lands. We should be the Saudis of Canada. Why are our people sleeping on the streets?
The speaker also condemned the Natural Resource Transfer Act, arguing that Indigenous communities should be thriving on their own lands, comparable to the wealth seen in oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia. However, the reality is that many Indigenous people are struggling with homelessness and addiction, and their communities are being woefully neglected. This native was so aggrieved that he even issued a direct challenge to Trudeau, urging him to visit their territory and witness the issues firsthand.
Proxy for Chief Roy Whitney at Tsuut'ina Nation. To back up what Chief Jacko just said and Chief Lehman, I want to notify you, Mr. Minister, if you listen, quit being on your phone or talking and listen to us. That's what you're here for.
Another native, a woman this time around, delivered a powerful message to the attending government minister, demanding his attention and respect. She was frustrated by the minister's apparent distraction and lack of engagement, urging him to stop looking at his phone and truly listen to the concerns being raised. She also expressed deep frustration over the government's attempts to undermine treaties with the Imperial Crown, stressing that such actions are inappropriate and disrespectful.
That you come and talk to the rights holders. In early March of 2016, your Prime Minister came to our nation. At that time, we invited him to come and meet with Treaties 1 to 11 rights holders. He has yet to come. Your ministers come for 2 hours and then they take off. And the same thing looking on their phones while we're trying to address our issues with them. There's got to be respect.
This woman had quite a lot on her mind as she recalled how Prime Minister Trudeau had visited their nation in 2016 and had been invited to meet with the treaty rights holders, a meeting that still hasn't happened. Instead, ministers visit briefly, often appearing disinterested and distracted, as evidenced by their constant phone usage during important discussions. She then pointed out how this lack of respect and genuine engagement contributes to the ongoing issues faced by Indigenous communities, such as poverty, addiction, and mental health problems.
But you're ignoring my emails and my letters and my text messages to your own cell phone number. So I want to know why you're not listening to my voice and my community's voice, which I carry. And when are you going to meet with my community to discuss this issue of illegal dumping and toxicity in my community of the illegal dumping and the wastewater and the characterization of a large site?
Another representative echoed these sentiments, expressing deep frustration with the government's failure to listen and respond to their community's needs. This representative highlighted the government's disregard for their communications, noting that emails, letters, and even text messages to the minister's private cell phone go unanswered. The constant neglect has left the community feeling ignored and undervalued, despite the government's claims of being committed to listening to Indigenous voices.
And his minister adds that Canada will not be able to accommodate all Indigenous concerns. What that means is that they have decided to willfully violate their constitutional duties and obligations. Mr. Minister, Mr. Speaker, sounds like a most important relationship, doesn't it? Why doesn't the Prime Minister just say the truth and tell Indigenous peoples?
The representative's plea was clear. The government must start listening to the communities it claims to support. This involves more than just attending assemblies and making promises. Engagement actually required real action and genuine concern. The representative stressed that their community is tired of empty words and is demanding concrete steps towards improvement. The continuous disregard has only deepened the community's frustrations and highlighted the gap between government rhetoric and reality.
And happy National Indigenous Peoples Day. Today we celebrate the unique heritage and cultures of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. On this day, and throughout National Indigenous History Month, we recognize the important contributions Indigenous peoples have made and continue to make to our country. And while we can't be together this year, we still can and should take the time to learn about, honor, and celebrate the history, traditions, languages, and cultures of Indigenous peoples.
No doubt, these powerful messages from Indigenous leaders were suggestive of the urgent need for the Canadian government to respect and honor their commitments. The government's current approach was not only ineffective, but also damaging, and it perpetuated a cycle of neglect and frustration. It was certainly time for a change, and that begins with truly listening to and respecting Indigenous voices.
Parliament has now passed Bill C-45, which will legalize and strictly regulate access to cannabis. We will soon have a new system in place, one that keeps cannabis out of the hands of our kids and keeps profits away from organized crime. Today, I'm also pleased to announce that the new recreational cannabis regime will officially come into force on October 17th.
All in all, the sentiments expressed here reflect growing discontent towards Justin Trudeau, even beyond Indigenous communities and across broader Canadian society. Many feel that Trudeau's promises during his initial election were compelling and inspiring, yet he has largely failed to deliver on them. However, cannabis legalization, of all things, stands out as a notable achievement and is viewed as a progressive step that is beneficial to the economy.
Internal polls, the most recent are from January to June, but they tell a clear story. Canadians were giving the government a failing grade. The polls show that more Canadians said the government was on the wrong track every week for 6 months, and that gap between wrong and right was widening. The PMO got the message, and in July, the Prime Minister shuffled his cabinet, putting one of his rising stars, Nova Scotia's.
But there are far bigger issues like the ongoing housing crisis, which highlights significant failures in Trudeau's leadership. Critics argue that after nearly a decade in power, the government's plea for trust in re-election to fix problems it contributed to feels disingenuous and manipulative. And the frustration extends beyond policy failures to perceptions of corruption and self-serving governance. This perceived cycle of political manipulation and inequity has even resulted in resignations from within Trudeau's own family ranks, signaling internal disillusionment.
If the Trudeau government loses support in Quebec, well, that is the ballgame in the next election. And that's one of the big takeaways from this series of internal polling. The Trudeau government has little choice but to gear its priorities to the priorities of Quebecers. even if those priorities might be at odds with the rest of the country.
So it's no surprise that Indigenous communities, alongside other marginalized groups, are leveraging their collective voice to demand accountability and change. This rising dissent is expected to exert considerable pressure on the Liberal government to address systemic issues more effectively or face significant electoral consequences. As these criticisms intensify and become more widespread, the future of Trudeau's leadership and the Liberal Party in electoral prospects appear increasingly uncertain. But presently, the opinion polls suggest Trudeau is slipping, and that's exactly what we've been trying to say so far. However, fresh elections are still an entire year away, as sad as that is.